Let's talk about public debt. You can think of it like the government's running tab, a massive bill that one way or another affects every single one of us.
So to really get our heads around this, just imagine for a second. What if a whole country had a credit card? Because anytime a government spends more money than it brings in through taxes, it has to borrow. And all of those loans, all that borrowing, well, it adds up. And that's what we call public debt.
Okay, so let's get a bit more formal. The textbook definition you're looking at here tells us public debt is just the total sum of all the loans a government takes on to pay its bills. It can borrow from its own citizens, from big banks, or even from other countries. It's the grand total of what the nation owes.
So here's our game plan. First, we're going to see why government debt is nothing like your personal loan. Then, we'll get into the good debt versus the bad debt. After that, we'll look at all the different types of debt in the government's toolkit, and we'll wrap it all up with the bottom line.
First up, this is not your average loan. You know, it's so tempting to think of government debt like our own debt, a mortgage or a credit card statement. But honestly, the government's playing a completely different ball game with a totally different set of rules.
So, what's the first big difference? It's all about where the money comes from. For you and me, we're pretty much limited to borrowing from banks and lenders inside our own country. A government, though, it can cast a much wider net. It can borrow from its own people and its own banks, sure, but also from foreign governments and huge international organizations.
Okay, this next one is kind of wild. Compulsion. A government, especially during a huge crisis like a war, can actually force its citizens or its banks to lend it money. Yeah, that's a power you and I definitely don't have when we're trying to get a loan.
The whole reason for borrowing is different, too. When we borrow, it's usually for our own benefit, right? A house, a car, a business we want to start. The goal is personal gain. A government, at least in theory, borrows for the good of everyone, to build roads, fund hospitals, things for the welfare of society.
And finally, how the debt gets paid back. This is a huge one. We have to pay our loans back from our own income, our own savings. A government has a much more powerful tool at its disposal. It can just tax the entire population to repay its debts.
This table right here from our source material really just sums it all up perfectly. It lays out all those key differences we just walked through, where the loan comes from, what it's for, and the unique powers a government has that we just don't.
Okay, next section. Debt that builds versus debt that drains, because it turns out not all government debt is created equal. Some of it can actually build a nation up, while other kinds can, they can drain it dry. Which naturally leads to the big question, right? Is all this government debt just a bad thing? And the answer, maybe surprisingly, is a definite no. It really depends on what that borrowed money is being used for. So on one side of the coin, you have what are called productive debts. And the best way to think about these is as investments. The government borrows money for a project that's actually going to generate its own income later on. Think a toll road or a new power plant. The idea is that the project basically pays for itself. And here are some classic examples of that. We're talking about building railways, putting up irrigation systems to help farmers, developing power projects, or even setting up big industries like steel production. All of these things are assets that boost the country's economy and can generate a real return on that initial investment.
But then you have the flip side, unproductive debts. These are loans for stuff that doesn't make any money back. Our source material calls this a dead weight on the government, which is a pretty powerful way to put it. It's a dead weight because the debt has to be paid back entirely through taxes, without any direct profit from the spending.
The two big examples here are pretty stark. Financing a war is probably the most classic case. Or sometimes, a government just has to borrow to cover its everyday expenses when tax money doesn't cover the bills. These might be necessary sometimes, but they are pure costs that don't build anything for the future.
All right, let's keep going. It turns out productive and unproductive aren't the only ways economists slice and dice public debt. There are a few other ways to classify it, giving the government a debt for pretty much every season.
First up, you've got internal versus external debt. This one's pretty simple. Internal is when the government borrows from its own people and its own banks. External is when it goes outside its borders and borrows from other countries or big international groups like the World Bank.
Okay, now this next one is a little weird. You've got redeemable versus irredeemable debt. Redeemable is exactly what it sounds like. The government promises to pay back the original loan amount after a certain time. But with irredeemable debt, the government never pays back the original loan. It just pays interest on it, forever.
Debt can also be sorted by its timeline, even if the names are a bit confusing. So long-term debt, for a year or more, is often called funded debt. It's usually for those huge projects. Then there's short-term debt, paid off in less than a year, which is known as unfunded debt. That's more for managing day-to-day cash flow.
And finally, this brings us back to that distinction we touched on earlier, voluntary versus compulsory. Most of the time, government debt is voluntary. People and banks choose to buy government bonds. But, like we said, in those rare emergency situations, the government can actually force the issue.
This chart here does a great job of visualizing all these different types of debt as a kind of financial toolkit. Depending on what's going on, whether they're building a massive dam or just trying to manage a short-term cash crunch, the government can pull out the exact type of debt it needs for the job.
All right, let's wrap this up and get to the bottom line. If you only remember a few things from our whole conversation today, make it these.
Okay, here are the key takeaways. First, and this is the big one, public debt is not like your personal debt. Governments have these unique powers we talked about. Second, remember that not all debt is created equal. Productive debt is an investment, while unproductive debt is a drain. And finally, just remember the governments have this whole diverse toolkit of debt types they can use to manage the economy.
And that really leaves us with one final and pretty critical question to think about, a question that comes straight from our source material. At what point does all this borrowing stop being a useful tool and start becoming a vicious cycle? When does a government's tab turn into a dangerous debt trap?